To my dearest friends, I am honored to welcome you back once more for what may very well be the most destructive part on our long saga, covering the apocalyptic wars for Armageddon. For thousands of years, this world stood as one of the brightest of jewels within the segmentum solar, with its immense populace producing a near limitless supply of industrial and military tools destined to be dispersed through the vastness of the galaxy. Yet this is not what Armageddon is best known for. The planet instead has been relegated to a position of infamy for being the site to some of the most devastating and cataclysmic of wars that the Imperium has ever been forced to endure. The First War saw a Primarch briefly return to our mortal realms, with the Demon Lord Angren heading the reunited legion of the World Eaters, and while he was not successful in his attack, he did leave a malign scar upon the very soul of the world. The second came around 500 years later, when the green tide of Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka descended, to bring a truly incomparable war and to claim this ancient world for the Orcs. Only the iron resolve of heroes such as Commissar Yarrick were sufficient to repel the green-skinned invaders and to prevent the collapse of the entire planet. But, despite their victory, they were never actually able to slay Gazgul, who, in the wake of his failure, retreated back into the stars, plotting and preparing for the decisive and climactic act of his grand plan. And this, my dearest friends, is where we left off from our prior story. So today we shall be experiencing the unbridled madness of the Third War, starting with the build-up of the Orky forces, before moving through to the full scale of the invasion. But without further ado, I do believe that it is now time for us to begin. Once more, we must walk amidst the ashes of devastation to find a world yet to recover from its previous torment, yet this time more than prepared for a renewed campaign in the form of the Third War for Armageddon. Peace was finally achieved across Armageddon in the year 941 of the 41st millennium, with the repulsion of the prior greenskin forces. But once again, its citizens were given no time to take pause and breathe. The world was simply too valuable to the Imperium for it to languish in ruin. And so, like a wounded beast, it was to be stitched back together and put out to work, hopefully this time for good. An enormous Mechanicus effort had been called upon to rebuild the shattered hive cities and to reignite the old foundries, as unfortunately many of the Armageddon survivors had been drafted into the planetary defense forces, significantly reducing the potential workforce of this world. In addition to the vast conscription plan for the ground troops, the Imperial Lords had decreed for the orbital defensive capabilities of the system to be enhanced to a truly prodigious scale. Space stations, monitoring posts, and stellar fortresses were erected throughout the local region, whilst a newly reinforced battle fleet was to be permanently stationed around Armageddon, hopefully being sufficient to repel any future attackers should they ever foolishly decide to return. Though confident in their new armada, the fortifications would soon prove themselves to be less than adequate, yet none within the Imperium could have anticipated how soon it would be before their forces were called upon once again. For you see, out in the darkness of the void, Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka had kept his eye upon this blasted world. He had indeed been defeated upon Armageddon, and yet was in no way deterred from his prophetic vision of toppling it for the orcs, leaving him now to simply bide his time and plan out what would be his climactic and victorious return. But the Warboss was not exactly subtle in his preparations. In order to muster his forces, he launched a series of invasions upon a number of nearby worlds, using them as an opportunity to acquire valuable resources for his mechs, and to send out a message to the other orcs that Ghazghul was back and ready for another war. It didn't take long before the Lords of Armageddon heard of this slew of worlds, falling beneath the green boots of a particularly large boss. But almost immediately, they pieced together that this horde was led by none other than of the beast of Armageddon himself. Thus, Sebastian Yarrick, the old hero of Hades' hive, once again came out of retirement and pledged to hunt down the boss, to finally put an end to his warpath and to seek vengeance for all of the lives lost during the prior war. An immense strike force was assembled, being made up of the veteran Steel Legionaries, an attached armored regiment replete with Baneblade tanks, and a crusading force of the Black Templars, led by the High Marshal Helbrecht. Ghazghul, however, was blissfully unaware of the retributive army hunting him down, and so he led a boisterous invasion to the world of Golgotha, with the intention of enslaving the entire population, who would soon be put to work in producing the arms and armaments needed for his return to Armageddon. His plan here had been partially devised by a crazed mech known as Orky, who had constructed a bombastic assortment of teleporters, allowing the orcs to materialize across the planet in a great surprise attack. But this is where the beast once again met with the Commissar. The Imperials, hot on Gaz's trail, managed to catch up to the boss only a short few weeks after the initial invasion, with Yarrick, Helbrecht, and the Imperial armies all making planetfall, intent on beheading the boss and ending his once and for all. As a most unusual sight, Commissar Yarrick was witnessed riding atop a personalized Baneblade, known as the Fortress of Arrogance, leading a squadron of the super-heavy tanks as they charged directly into the Orc lines. Unfortunately, however, the Orcs had their own mechanized units, and his tank was eventually run over and crushed by a turbocharged battle fortress. The battered body of the Commissar was dragged forth from the wreckage and thrown to the feet of Ghazghul, but it was at this moment where something most peculiar occurred. The boss, previously seen as little more than a brute, spoke to Yarrick in a slightly crude yet coherent form of High Gothic, a point which I should note as being truly astounding, as most orcs will struggle to understand even simplified text in Low Gothic. The conversation, however, was brief. The boss simply pointed at Yarrick and praised him for providing a great fight before providing him with an escape craft, prompting him to return to Armageddon and to prepare for what he promised would be the greatest fight. With little choice, Yarrick boarded his vessel, but even over the rumbling engines, he heard the roaring cacophony of the orcs and understood that this was an unbreakable promise, that the final war for Armageddon was now all but inevitable. Scarcely 5 decades had passed since the end of the prior invasion. But as the 41st millennium came to its close, it seemed as though this was still an age defined only by war. It was on the celebratory day, known as the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, when the orcs once again returned to Armageddon, with Ghazghul now prepared to lead his second attack, and to finally seize this world for Gork and Mork. Monitoring stations throughout the system erupted with warning lights as they detected within the distant void the arrival of an armada so immense that some officers believed that it must have been a glitch in their system. But there had been no mistake, as the beast of Armageddon had successfully amassed what could easily be considered as the largest assemblage of orcs ever seen in our modern age. The fleet was incomparably large, and with each passing moment, countless more of the crude, jagged ships violently careened into the outer reaches, spluttering with so much exhaust that the distant stars themselves were dimmed from view. The largest ships were the space hulks, crude amalgams consisting of hundreds of smaller vessels, mangled and mashed together into a ghastly yet impressively large craft. They were flanked by ramshackle cruisers, bedecked in glyphs of war, sporting gigantic cannons, sometimes being larger than the vessel's own engines. Smaller crafts darted alongside, some appearing to be conventional Orky vehicles adapted for spaceflight, simply by strapping an immense thruster to the back, which, for some inexplicable reason, seems to be a sufficient form of engineering for those who believe in the abilities of the mechs. With a growing sense of horror, the Imperials realized that their own battle fleet, though reinforced in preparation for such an attack, was outnumbered 6-1 by the Orky Armada. Further, the monitoring stations were quickly recalibrated to detect green-skinned vessels, at which point they revealed that this was only the first of 3 gargantuan fleets. It was impossible to quantify, but the 2 remaining Orc fleets were somehow larger than this vanguard force, meaning that this was perhaps the largest fleet in history to ever invade an Imperial world. Though outnumbered and outgunned, the Armageddon battle fleet fought valiantly, lighting up the darkness of the void with salvos of torpedo fire, great beams of energy lances, and even the rare yet incomparably powerful blasts of Nova cannons. The Orc vessels, however, just kept coming. Crippled cruisers, even if missing half of their hull, would careen through the growing carnage, ramming into the Imperial crafts before detonating in a glorious explosion, slowly whittling away at the fleet, one ship at a time. The battle raged for weeks, with the void becoming naught but a charred graveyard, hosting empty, blasted-out wrecks, drifting endlessly through the dark. Yet the Orcs never stopped, and their reinforcements never ended, until eventually the battle fleet had been almost entirely annihilated, and as the system burned, all that remained untouched was of Armageddon itself. Though the situation appeared bleak, there was still hope to be found upon the surface. Yarrick had already returned from captivity and had spent every waking moment preparing this world for what he saw as the inevitable reinvasion of the Orcs. Thus, over 20 Space Marine chapters had sent their brothers, whilst innumerable guard regiments, conclaves of the Sisterhood, and even legions of the Adeptus Titanicus had pledged their might to the final defense of this world. The defenses had been layered, reinforced, and blessed with all the power the Imperium could muster, but against this storm of green, one could not help but wonder if such preparations would prove to be enough. As the last of the orbital bastions fell in flame, and as the last of the Imperial fleet was utterly obliterated, the Greenskins were finally provided with an open field with which to make their ground invasion. Within their armada, the mechs had produced a fleet of rocks, which are asteroids, or sometimes other forms of space debris, retrofitted with gargantuan thrusters and crude piloting systems. These were now to be activated, and as each turbocharged rocket flared into life, the rocks were sent plummeting down, screaming through the atmosphere on great trails of smoke and fire. The first wave smashed down across every surface of Armageddon, splitting mountains in twain, obliterating small islands, and rupturing the defensive networks which surrounded many of the great hives. Ghazghul had specifically ordered for a series of rocks to be targeted at Hades' hive, the site of the climactic battle which ultimately led to his defeat during the First War, prepared to make an example of what many Imperials saw as a symbol of hope in their defiance against the Orcs. Though it had once withstood his siege, no hive could be expected to endure a bombardment of this scale. There was no time for evacuation, nor an opportunity for a last stand, and in but a single moment, the city that had stood for millennia was reduced to a smouldering crater of molten slag and rising ash. Across the planet, hordes of the Orcs emerged from the ruins of their transportation vessels, swarming out to cover every surface, bringing the brutality of war back to Armageddon. No place was safe from their advance, but thankfully, there was not a single region of the planet to have been left undefended. The jagged reaches of the fire wastes, choked by the harsh clouds of industrial smog, only became more inhospitable as a great battle was fought between the warband of Urgok the Unstoppable and the Imperials, led by the Sisters of the Argent Shroud and a strike force of the Flesh Tearers. The southern Deadlands were also invaded, with the Orcs seeing it as being a potential staging ground for them to prepare subsequent attacks against the central continent. The Overfiend of Octarius led this invasion, often unleashing his bands of White Lightning Bikers to clash with the mounted brothers of the White Scars. Deep within the equatorial jungle, long-forgotten tribes of the Orcs re-emerged, awakened from slumber by all the ruckus and entirely reinvigorated for a new battle. In truth, these feral tribes consisted of the scant survivors of the prior invasion, combined with the new boys who had emerged from the fungal spores that were now endemic to the jungles. Entire forests were flattened by their stampedes as the warbands adorned themselves in crude war paints and animalistic trophies before charging out to join in the wider war. Most interestingly, not all of the aforementioned rocks were destined to smash into the planet's surface, and rather, some of them actually began to slow during their descent. Enormous gravitational dampeners installed by the mech genius Archimedes generated a peculiar force field that braked the vessels as they neared the surface, causing them to land as gently as an Orc could possibly allow. From here, the rocks were then cracked open, revealing the teleportation engines of the mech, which sparked into life, allowing a new horde of Orcs to stream out, now accompanied by convoys of tanks, mobs of death dreads, and even the titanic walking gargants. Hope, at this stage, truly seemed to falter. The defenders, once resolute, now stared in disbelief as the Orcs appeared to multiply across every landscape, reinforced by a seemingly endless tide of green-skinned brutes and violent engines of war. The deserts were filled with plumes of dust from the speed-freak convoys. The hive cities were besieged from every side, and thanks to the teleporters, it had been reported that Ghazghul himself was appearing for every major battle, directly leading the charge and personally sealing his victory. There comes a point in every war where the tide does not merely turn, and rather, it all comes crashing down. It is the moment where an ordered defense suddenly feels futile in the face of an overwhelming adversary, and where commanders begin to wonder if they are simply throwing their soldiers to their deaths for absolutely no possible gain. For the Imperials upon Armageddon, many such moments concurrently arose across the planet, sapping the morale of all but the sternest of officers who dared not relent in their seemingly doomed mission. One of the first of the great cities to fall was Hive Acheron, though as an excruciatingly painful fact, it did not fall due to an external siege. Found far to the east of Armageddon Secundus, this city had previously stood as one of the final bastions of humanity during the prior war, defiant against the orcs who had almost conquered the entire world. Yet its opportunity to relive its past glories was stolen from within. Hermann von Strab, that disgraced bastard who once held the title of planetary governor and whose incompetence had cost the lives of millions during the Second War, had emerged from hiding, returning as an opportunistic little swine eager to seize power during this time of chaos. The inept noble, who was at this point wanted for a litany of crimes, including 2 counts of improper dress, must have descended into a state of madness as a fugitive, as he had now done the unthinkable and thrown in his lot with the orcs. It is believed that he personally sabotaged the Hive's defense protocols, shutting down automated turrets, disabling power grids, and most damningly, allowing a group of orc commandos to infiltrate the city, emerging en masse in a swift yet bloodless coup. Von Strab declared that he had joined forces with Ghazghul and sent out a mass communication urging the wider populace to cast aside their allegiances to the dying Imperium and to rebel against their commanding officers. This call was not particularly successful, as we must remember that Armageddon was, at this point, defended by one of the greatest assemblies of Imperial military might seen since the days of the Great Crusade, a presence which inspired almost every guardsman into a new state of devoted fervor. With that said, the nobles of Hive Acheron were far more keen on maintaining their own power for as long as possible, and so they agreed to von Strab's ascension, giving over control of the Hive to the treacherous governor and his Orky allies. Back in the fire wastes, the relentless Orc advance, which once vastly outnumbered the meager Imperials, had since been slowed to a pathetic crawl. The so-called Iron Line of fortifications were yet to be breached, and the defensive outpost at Sreya Rock still held fast, with its long-range macro cannons holding the green-skinned Gargants and Stompers at bay. Unfortunately, however, this tactical victory was soon to be marred by a most egregious discovery. The presiding canoness, known as Carmina, had orchestrated a brilliant maneuver, with the flesh-tearers driving scores of the orcs into the gun lines of the Sisterhood, eventually forcing an all-out retreat from Urgok the Unstoppable. The flesh-tearers, however, could not be controlled, and they ran down the fleeing orcs, butchering any and all they could catch, until they reached the meager fortifications of the Gaius Point militia. The under-equipped humans had assembled themselves into a meek force to aid in the defense of their world, and reveled at the arrival of the Emperor's angels, but tragically, they were all to be slaughtered by the bloodthirsty Marines. Hundreds were murdered. Some literally ripped limb from limb, as the flesh-tearers lived up to their namesake, and painted the grounds red with the blood of the innocent. The attached Sisterhood, utterly horrified by this monstrous act, sent word to the Inquisition that the chapter should be investigated for heresy, a black mark which still stains the legacy of this chapter. Gabriel Seth, in an attempt to shield his brothers, reorganized his forces and dispatched them deeper into the fire wastes, only sending them into battles where there was no chance they might encounter another Imperial soul. Legends say that the Orcs soon came to dread the approach of the flesh-tearers, after repeatedly witnessing them feasting upon the dead, gorging themselves on flesh, sometimes green skin, and sometimes human. Thus, most uncharacteristically, the Orcs were noted to sometimes flee before a coming battle, notably retreating from the Serestus River mineral storage facility in order to distance themselves from the Marines who they named as the Eaters of the Dead. As the war dragged on, the more strategically significant of regions quickly became the focal points to some of the fiercest and bloodiest of battles, with both sides shuttling greater and greater numbers of their troops into the growing meat grinders. One such battle would be of the infamous siege of Hive Hellsreach. Located upon the southern coast of Armageddon Secundus, the city had previously been the site of a valiant yet futile defensive campaign during the prior war, eventually falling after a crazed coven of weird boys drowned the city in a psychic tide of madness. Despite being rebuilt during the interwar period, Hive Hellsreach was once again plunged into the chaos of war, as the Orcs had specifically targeted the city in order to claim its enormous docks. Leading the Imperial defense was none other than Merrick Grimaldus, Reclusiarch of the Black Templars, in command of his Hellsreach crusade, several regiments of the Armageddon Steel Legion, and even a grouping of Titans from the Legio Invigilata. Though formidable, when at war with the Orcs, one's prowess in battle can often prove to be a double-edged sword, as it did not take long for the Greenskins to flock to Hellsreach, after hearing that the Templars were offering up one of the finest of battles to be found across the entire world. After a few days, millions of Orcs had joined in the attack, with well over 100 Gargants littering the outer city, dueling with the ancient Imperial Titans in a truly deafening battle of the God engines. Though they fought valiantly, with every single Imperial contributing their efforts to the defense, they simply could not hope to outlast this seemingly endless tide of the Orcs. Buildings were lost, then streets, then entire districts, swallowed up by the oncoming horde, with the Marines and their allies eventually being pushed further back towards the docks. But it was then that the Orcs launched a ploy so cunning that Mork himself would have let out a big, toothy grin. For you see, the Greenskins who landed within the deadlands of the southern pole had quickly launched an armada of submersible vessels, which were now poised to emerge within the Hellsreach harbour to unload a new army of the Orcs right into the rear flank of the besieged Crusaders. But Hellsreach was only one city upon Armageddon, and though its defenders fought valiantly against the Green Tide, we must remember that the wider planet was similarly lashing out in what seemed to be its death throes. By this point, the surface of Armageddon, which had once been divided into tidy sectors, delineating complex defensive networks around each city, was now nothing more than a patchwork of fire and ruin. What little remained of Imperial order had since been entirely devoured by the Green Tide, with entire continents becoming indistinguishable from the battlefields that defiled them. In truth, the war was already incomparably large, but now it had arisen into the realm of an apocalypse. The equatorial jungles had been the site to some of the fiercest of battles during the first two wars, and once again they were to be transformed into one of the most brutal theatres of this great invasion. It had remained infested with feral Orcs since Ghazghul's first attack, But the warring tribes were now newly united and eager to pour out from the tangle in search of a good fight. But they were not to run rampant, unopposed. Specialized units from both the Orc Hunting Steel Legion and of the infamous jungle fighters of Catachan had been dispersed from the Cerberus base to wage a vicious campaign intended to at least contain the feral tribes to the darkness beneath the canopy. Though the Catachan regiments were well adapted to jungle warfare, it became increasingly clear that the Orcs simply had more boys and squigs than the Imperials had guns or even ammo. Nevertheless, booby traps were layered across every exposed surface, camouflaged snipers were set up in the tall trees, and complex ambushes were set up to corner the ferals and to burn them down into ashes. But amidst the insufferably humid war zone and between the blood-slicked vines, something rather sinister had begun to stir. A mysterious chapter of the Astartes, known as the Relictors, had answered the call to defend Armageddon. Yet it soon became clear that their interests did not actually lie with the war effort at large. In truth, the Marines were operating under orders from the shadowy agents of the Inquisition, who had dispatched them on a secretive mission to retrieve any abandoned relics, specifically targeting those left over from the days of Angron's genocidal rampage. Pushing through the tangle, they were searching for the last known location of Angron's monolith, a towering monument constructed by cultists to venerate the re-emergence of the demonic Primarch, which was said to contain a shard of his blood-slicked axe. The Relictors ignored all calls for Imperial aid until they heard a Vox call, which reportedly stated that the guardsmen in a specific area were losing their minds, babbling incoherently about blood and skulls. With this lead, they finally reached the monolith, at which point the demonic structure seemed to respond to their presence, sending out a blaring pulse of energy, attracting a new tide of the greenskins to descend upon them. One of the Relictors tore the axe shard from the monolith, which instantly threw him into a berserk rage, causing him to lash out, ripping and tearing apart both the Orcs and Marines alike. There are some conflicting sources which read that this event also caused a dormant warp gate to open, awakening a pack of time-frozen world eaters who similarly leapt into the fray, hacking through the enemy lines, completely unaware that 500 years had passed. But through the bloody carnage, the Relictors were successful in subduing their afflicted brother, and with their treasured artifact in hand, they promptly withdrew from the fight, leaving Armageddon entirely just to hand over this gift to their inquisitorial masters. The situation across the western continent of Armageddon Prime was at this point becoming untenable. A daring submersible invasion launched from the fire wastes allowed the Orcs to avoid a head-on assault into the immense defensive lines of Hive Tempestora, ultimately leading to the city's fall and conquest. Further south, a rather intelligent Orc known as Gazgrim attempted to lure several Imperial armies out from their defensive posts and to pursue him into the open plains of Anthrand, where they would be easy prey for his gangs of speed freaks. The Guard, however, did not take the bait, and instead responded with a titanic barrage of artillery fire, forever transforming the flatlands into a heavily cratered landscape of ruin. In response, Gazgrim called off his plan and orchestrated a far more successful flanking maneuver across the Death Ridge, annihilating 3 full regiments of the Ocanon phalanx, whilst also opening up a route towards the vitally important water plant known as Gatana Bay. Returning to the war zone surrounding Hive Hell's Reach, the Imperial situation had at this point turned desperate. The city was nigh unrecognizable, with most of the outer habs having collapsed under the weight of ceaseless bombardments, while the streets themselves were barely visible, crushed beneath piles of rubble and heaps of broken corpses. The battle, though now heavily tipped in favor to the Orcs, would go on to become the stuff of imperial legend, as the reclusiarch Grimaldus still held command over his dwindling crusaders and faithful allies. Commissar Yarrick had dispatched an order to the defenders of Hell's Reach that they should attempt to spread out through the city, not in the hopes of reclaiming it, but simply to evacuate any remaining survivors before the hive inevitably fell. This would soon prove to be almost impossible, as the Orcs had prepared a truly monstrous engine of war, a mega-gargant named as Godbreaker, which had previously destroyed the hive of Stygia, and whose guns were now levied directly against Hell's Reach. Ultimately, the Imperial defenders were forced to sacrifice 2 of their precious Warhound Titans to distract the Gargant for just long enough to allow an Ordinatus engine to fire its Nova Cannon and to finally destroy the great Godbreaker. The explosion could be felt across Armageddon, but as the smokes across Hell's Reach cleared, it soon became clear just how dire the Imperial defense truly was. Grimaldus was one of only 35 Templars to have survived, and along with a small attachment of both the Sisterhood and the Imperial Guard, they had now been pushed back to the Temple of the Emperor Ascendant, the final intact structure found at the very heart of the burning city. There would be no reinforcements and no miracles, but as the Orcs breached the temple gates, they were met with bolter, flame, and sword. Every defender, be they man, woman, or Astartes, gave their lives within those crumbling halls. Bayard, the Emperor's champion to this crusade, was overwhelmed, caught by an errant strike, just as he buried his great sword into the chest of an Orc nob. Prioress Sindel of the Argent Shroud, fighting to the last with her remaining sisters, similarly fell to the onslaught. Grimaldus, in his final moments, was reported to have bellowed out, "I have dug my grave in this place, and I will either triumph or I will die." But his words were swallowed up, as the temple itself finally collapsed under the weight of the greenskin siege, sealing the fates of all within to death. Somehow, in the shadow of innumerable defeats, and with the hordes of Ghazghul's Orcs rising higher and higher with each passing day, the flames of imperial resistance did not die. Though the green tide ceaselessly surged with fury and ruin, there were some select regions of Armageddon where the defenders stood defiant against what seemed like a certain defeat. The Mordian Iron Guard had bravely repelled the Greenskins from the hive of Deathmire. The Arctic deadlands of the south were ultimately secured by the White Scars, and though the refineries of Phoenix Island now burned, the Black Dragons had at least prevented them from falling into the hands of the Orcs. The Imperial defense was undeniably unstable, but it was a defense nonetheless, and at its center stood the old man of legend, Commissar Yarrick. Just as he had done so on Golgotha, Old Baal I was seen to ride atop the fortress of Arrogance, charging straight into the thick of battle, its treads grinding over Orc wreckage as its 11 barrels barked their hellish blasts into the endless mobs. Still, some officers only saw him hunched over the glowing strategiums of their command centers, poring over data feeds and vox calls, sleeplessly orchestrating the grand strategy of Armageddon, fueled on little more than his burning desire for vengeance. His leadership had earned him the rare respect of the deployed chapter masters, some of who readily deferred to his orders, even if they knew it meant that their battle brothers would be cast into the fires. Returning to the plains of Anthrand, Gazgrim, not to be confused with Gazgul, having now opened a path to the Gatana water processing plant, entrusted the assault to a lower boss known as Judrog Iron Tooth, despite seeing him as quite an untrustworthy git. Splitting his forces, Judrog sent most of his boys to enact an amphibious siege from the rear, but the front lines would be assaulted by what many now consider to have been the largest assemblage of death dreads ever seen on a battlefield. Some reports claim there were thousands of the walkers, clunking away in unison as they marched out from the wastes, but in their path was the heavily defended bastion of Gate Number 9. This was the only way through to the plant, yet it was defended by an unprecedented formation of 17 venerable dreadnoughts drawn from a multitude of chapters, but led by Brother Damus of the Angel's Porphyr. The Hellfire variants unleashed their salvos of crack missiles and beams of las cannon fire, blasting and melting through the stumbling horde of ramshackle scrap, whilst the ironclads marched up to form a truly unbreakable line. Eventually, however, the Death Dreads crossed the distance and piled into the chaos of vehicular melee. However, they soon found themselves stuck within the bottleneck of the relatively narrow gate, suddenly erasing their numerical advantage and closing off any potential routes to escape. The battle raged for days, with the packed mobs of orc walkers in the back being bombarded by Thunderhawk's strafing runs, whilst those at the front were smashed apart and crushed to ruin by the fists of the ancient heroes. In the end, the Marines emerged victorious, having let not a single orc breach Gate Number 9, leaving a veritable ocean of scrapped engines to be strewn about in a great graveyard. But despite their success, 7 of their original 17 had been lost amidst the carnage, a price which some chapters would see as being simply too great to justify. Though the world still burned, there were some places where the fires had gradually faded to embers. Hive Hellsreach had been utterly demolished from the prior battle, and as such both the orcs and Imperial forces had abandoned the ruins, leaving the once bustling industrial city as a smouldering vista of death. The titanic detonation that felled the Gargant Godbreaker leveled half the city, and there could be little strategic reason to try and claim this ruined, smoke-shrouded husk. And yet, from beneath the devastation, something stirred. Amidst the ruins of the Temple of the Emperor Ascendant, that basilica where the Imperials made their heroic, albeit fatal stand, the stones began to move, toppling down to the ash below as a lone figure crawled his way out of the wreckage to stand tall upon Armageddon once more. Reclusiarch Grimaldus, burned, broken, and bloodied by the orcs, had endured the collapse as the sole survivor of the Hellsreach Crusade. Around him, the city burned, but it didn't take long for the Templar to note that this heat was not caused by the fires of war, but by the passing seasons of the world itself. For you see, the world of Armageddon has an elliptical orbit, meaning that as it travels around its parental star, it will sometimes swing dramatically closer to the blazing sun, subjecting the planet to scorching temperatures, whilst also triggering a slew of volcanic eruptions across the continents. This had been coined as the Season of Fire, a time which previously forced the old imperial populace to avoid spending extended periods outdoors lest they succumb to the hellish atmosphere. The heat was truly unbearable, and as it so happens, the inferno was so great that even the orcs were struggling to endure. Their war paints melted, dripping off from trucks and bikes, engines seized up, ammo caches caught alight, and the surface itself was quickly becoming too burningly hot to fight upon. Meanwhile, as the fires rose across Armageddon, an imperial resistance was starting to take root within the fallen city of Hive Acheron. The Imperium had not failed to notice the ascension of von Strab, and were well aware that the city was now firmly in the green hands of his Orky allies. The loyalist population had been imprisoned within the Undercity, locked away in vast cages, whilst the turncoat nobles above attempted to continue in their lavish existence, kept safe by the prodigious defences of their fortress city. But now, through the same tunnels that brought the orcs, came a motley crew of ragtag Imperials, led by the legendary figure Colonel Schaefer, and at his back were the 13th Penal Legion of the Last Chancers. Thieves, murderers, deserters, heretics, it did not matter their background, as they had been chosen for one final mission in exchange for a clean slate, one final chance to clear their name in the eyes of the Emperor, or to at least go out in a brilliant blaze of glory. Though the third war for Armageddon still raged, they had been dispatched with one mission, and one mission only, and it was to infiltrate the Orc city of Hive Acheron, to assassinate Hermann von Strab. Silently moving through the Undercity, dispatching mob after mob of Orc guards, they finally burst out into what they believed to be von Strab's personal chambers, but unfortunately they had been led directly into a trap. One of the Last Chancers, a latent psyker known as Lieutenant Cage, was at this point possessed by a demon, and much to the dismay of his comrades, pledged himself to serve von Strab, all in exchange for power. The Last Chancers were imprisoned and taken to a region of the Underhive known as the Great Valley of Acheron, a strange pit harbouring the fiery depths which provided a constant source of warmth to the lower hive. This was to be the site of their execution, but as they listened to the Overlord endlessly bloviate about miracles, martyrdoms, and of the will of Armageddon, Cage was seemingly able to break free. Temporarily shaking the immaterial cowl of possession, he seized this moment of clarity and lunged forward, grabbing von Strab before leaping down into the pit, sacrificing himself just to ensure that the traitorous bastard would finally be met with justice. Though the incompetent old governor had been successfully assassinated, the war for Armageddon was far from over. Grimaldus, taking up his Crozius Arcanum, departed from the ruins of Hellsreach, ready to continue in his own crusade as he responded to a desperate call for aid sent from his cousin chapter of the Celestial Lions. At the outbreak of the war, the chapter had proudly committed almost the entirety of their forces to Armageddon, with almost 1,000 brothers making planetfall. But rather tragically, when Grimaldus met with their ragged command, only 96 were found to have survived the carnage. This casualty rate was unheard of for the Marines. No other chapter, save for the smaller strike force of the Black Templars, had been shattered to this degree, decimated through every battle, leaving them in a precarious position where the utter destruction of their chapter seemed plausible. In truth, however, Pride leader Ekene Dubaku, who was at this point the most senior brother of their chapter, laid out to Grimaldus what he believed to be a treacherous conspiracy, intent on exterminating the Lions for daring to speak out against the Inquisition. Many years ago, 5 companies of their chapter had been deployed to assist an inquisitor named as Apollyon in putting down a rebellion upon the world of Qatar. Despite being met with little resistance and restoring order in only 3 months, the Marines were unfortunate enough to witness the relentless and merciless treatment of the innocent, which the Inquisitor claimed as being absolutely necessary. They were ultimately successful in putting down the rebellion, but as the Lions departed, they were forced to watch as the planet was condemned to death, with the Inquisitorial fleet systematically bombarding every settlement and every center until no Imperial life remained. The disgusted Lions outwardly criticized this act and sent out a mass condemnation, criticizing the deeds of the overly zealous Apollyon. But this insolence was not something which the Inquisition would ever forgive. Thus, upon Armageddon, it is believed that the vengeful Inquisitors sought to use the war as a means of destroying the chapter, entirely exterminating them by orchestrating a slew of unwinnable battles and a series of unfortunate events. Firstly, they were ordered to collect their entire chapter to defend Hive Volcanus. However, this is where the tragedy all begins. Many of their Thunderhawks were shot down as they traversed what should have been a safe airspace, sometimes blasted out of the sky by Imperial anti-aircraft cannons, with the operators mysteriously found dead, executed by a single shot to the back of the head. Further, it appears as though the pilots were supplied with false intelligence reports, as the surviving ships all seemed to land in areas where the Orks had set up explosive ambushes, while those that relocated to secondary or even tertiary LZs were led further towards the largest of greenskin strongholds. Fighting through the chaos, the Lions were sent a new order to reclaim a deep canyon known as the Mannheim Gap from the Orks, so as to cut off one of their passageways towards Volcanus. They had been informed that this was a dormant scrapyard, primarily used to store resources, and that it would be an easy, though quite protracted, battle. Thus, 4 companies were assembled, but as they passed into the canyon, they found it to be a bustling fortress, defended by dozens of scrap titans and heavily fortified outposts. To make matters worse, high up on the ridge, the Lions could see the faint outline of innumerable Ork cannons, which without warning opened fire, and from the frenzied barrage, all 400 of the Marines were slaughtered. Ekene Dubaku repeated several similar tales to Grimaldus, with the most sinister point being that in some of these battles, that the Lions were targeted by weapons and sometimes tactics that were undeniably imperial. He swore that from the ridgetop that he could spy the familiar glint of an imperial sniper scope, and we must acknowledge that for a war of this scale that it would not be inconceivable to think that there could have been a few Vindicare temple assassins prowling behind enemy lines. Their camps were sabotaged, their orbital vessels destroyed, and to make matters worse, he claimed that their apothecaries were specifically targeted by Imperial sniper fire, preventing them from reclaiming their brother's fallen gene seed, surely proof enough that their chapter was condemned to die. He only asked Grimaldus for one thing, and that was to administer their final rites, as the Lions were now intent on going out in a blaze of glory by charging back into the Mannheim Gap to join their brothers in death. Grimaldus, however, refused this death wish. He was disgusted at the thought that the Inquisition had done this, yet believed that the Lions could still rebuild, and that perhaps through their victory over Armageddon, that they could clear their name and stand proud once more. Thus, the Templar assembled a new force, and with an army at their backs, the surviving lions charged back into the canyon, where they ultimately seized victory from the orcs. Ekene Dubaku put down the presiding war boss, and though their own numbers had been whittled down, it now seemed as though their chapter may live on, to fight for another day. Helbrecht, High Marshal of the Black Templars, later named Dubaku as the new chapter master to the Celestial Lions. And in later years, they would go on to rebuild their numbers, taking up their posts once more as one of the 3 chapters to defend the region of the Alara's Vale. But, rather tragically, the Inquisition neither forgives nor forgets, and long after the Third War came to its close, they would pursue the lions into the lightless void to impart their revenge, one way or another. Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka, the cunningly brutal and brutally cunning warboss at the head of this entire war, had never really been a strategist in the traditional sense. It would be more accurate to call him a creature of momentum, a beast who wished to lead the greatest orc invasion in galactic history, directly from the riotous chaos of the front lines. I previously mentioned that thanks to Archimedes' teleporter network, that the warboss was able to join most every major battle across Armageddon, having been inexplicably sighted in the tribal wars of the jungle, at the destruction of Hell's Reach, and even at the dreadnought battle of Gatana Bay. For a time, this was glorious. He could pick and choose to arrive wherever the fighting was the loudest, bloodiest, and most satisfying. But as the season of fire blazed across Armageddon, even Gazgul had begun to grow restless. The insufferable heat had brought the war to a crawl, with neither side being able to launch any new offenses, eventually smothering even the largest and most entertaining of battles. Instead of setting out in conquest, both the Imperials and Orcs had decided to use this time to fortify their positions, solidifying control over the scattered territories, whilst erecting vast defensive networks to repel what they believed to be an inevitable second phase of the war. The dynamic front lines thusly calcified, and Armageddon became strangely stagnant, most unusual for this world which had been redefined as a realm of pure war. It was quite odd to see the orcs digging trenches and building mud forts, but they simply could not bear the heat, and so they simply sat around waiting for anything more fun than trudging across a scorching desert. Gazgul truly hated this. What a disappointment this war had become. This wasn't anything like what he envisioned. It was not the ultimate fight. It was not even fun. Armageddon had become a slow and grinding war of attrition, and for the first time in a long while, the prophet of Gork and Mork found himself plagued by an overwhelming sense of boredom. Makari, his long-suffering grot companion, fared no better. Once the self-proclaimed luckiest grot in the galaxy, he now found himself as little more than a glorified mascot, watching his boss's passion for war fade with each passing day. Gaz no longer ranted of visions or shouted about bringing the Great Green to reality, and instead he simply lazed around, muttering about how Armageddon's gotten soft. Makari, unable to endure the monotony, thusly chose to end it, performing what we could assume was the most pathetic suicide in greenskin history. He simply offed himself. But as fate would have it, the little blighter promptly awoke once more. As an unfortunate side effect of Ghazghul's power, Makari had found himself to reincarnate after every death, now cursed to follow the Warboss forevermore. Ghazghul didn't even flinch. He simply grunted, "Figures." But still, something had indeed changed. Gaz always wanted the war for Armageddon to be the greatest that the galaxy had ever seen, yet he was now stuck in a trench with a suicidal grot and a couple of sunburnt gits. Further, he had to admit to himself that his first invasion failed. And now his second try was similarly slowing down, so perhaps he had been wrong about Armageddon. Perhaps this world wasn't the one, and maybe his true Wa lay elsewhere. But with all this heavy thinking and head-scratching, Ghazghul didn't even notice that an Imperial tank had charged directly into his camp and had its battle cannon aimed directly towards his chest. With a booming blast, the boss was knocked back, the shell passing right through his torso, leaving a grisly wound where his organs really should have lived. With a surprising sense of alacrity, for one who had just been reincarnated, Makari grabbed a rusty knife, scampered atop the tank, pried open an observation hatch, and dropped inside. A small crowd of amused boys soon surrounded the tank, gruffly chuckling at the muffled sounds of human screams and at the occasional sprays of blood spewing out of the viewports. They didn't know if the boss behind them was dead, but they didn't really care, as this frenzied little grot was simply too entertainingly violent to look away from. Nevertheless, Gaz was not dead. Staggering to his feet, he decided that this wasn't some sort of defeat, but a sign. It was the signal he needed, the gentle push to show him that true war was not to be found in the dreary trenches, but out in the chaos of the galaxy, where a real fight was still waiting to be had. Rising to full height, he rallied his nobs, ordering them to continue the war in his stead and to try and make the best of Armageddon, even though it had gotten pretty zoggin dull. Then, without a moment to spare, he swaggered off, still sporting a great hole in his chest, to find himself a ship and to launch what he would go on to name as the Great Wa. The departure of Ghazghul was most unexpected to both the Orcs and the Imperials, but it did not mark the end to the Third War for Armageddon. Even though the Warboss had grown disinterested in the slowed conflict, I don't believe that he truly understood the scale to which this war had blossomed. It had bloomed through the years, growing with each passing moment into something that neither side could ever possibly hope to contain. Yarrick, upon hearing of his nemesis's flight, was in no way pleased. This wasn't a sign of victory, it was just an extension of the war, and so he promptly gathered his forces, combining several regiments of the Steel Legion with a crusading force of the Black Templars, and set out to hunt down the beast, only willing to rest once Ghazghul was finally dead. But for those left behind, there was no time to reflect. The season of fire came to its blistering end, and with it, the crucible of waiting was finally broken. The battlefields cooled, the engines sputtered into action, and all across Armageddon, the Third War surged back to life. Without Ghazghul, the Orcs were now unshackled from an overarching command, leading to many of the bosses forming their own war bands, setting out on truly brutal warpaths as they sought to seize this opportunity to carve out a new realm for themselves. This wasn't just a war anymore. This was the war to end all wars, the largest and bloodiest war that they had ever known. Once, they had called it Darbig Scrap, A simple name for a fun little fight, but now the orcs had started referring to Armageddon with a far grander title. This was Ragnar Ork. Word of this spread through the galaxy like wildfire, with orcs from every corner of the cosmos spending what teeth they could find just to make it to Ragnarok and to join in the bloody slaughter. Space hulks emerged from the warp. Cruisers rained debris through the upper atmosphere, and on the surface below, the growing warbands greeted their new mates with roars of laughter and bursts of shooter fire. Naturally, the Imperium had no choice but to respond. Hundreds of new regiments were mustered, dozens of Astartes companies summoned, and every call was made to bring the war engines of the Mechanicus down into the maelstrom. The High Lords of Terror, half blinded by panic and protocol, continued to pour men and machines into the fire, praying that quantity might succeed where strategy had failed. But the death toll was now incalculable. Entire hives had been ground to dust, the jungles had caught alight, and Armageddon itself groaned beneath the weight of the relentless armies marching atop scores of the nameless dead. But then came a time known as the Blackness. As the 41st millennium came to its close, reality itself shattered, with the Cicatrix Maledictum cleaving the galaxy in twain, ultimately smothering the light of the Astronomicon, leaving near every world to be isolated from the wider Imperium. Armageddon was one such world, and through the newborn gloom came the clawing talons of the warp. From the ruins of Hellsreach to the blasted plains of Anthrand, the ground below seemed to shudder, and as the air itself started to curdle, the first of the demons arrived upon Armageddon. Crawling from mass graves, peeling themselves from out of the shadows, the blood-soaked darkness seemed to coalesce, taking on the grotesque forms of the scions to the ruinous powers. They had not been drawn by any form of cult, but simply from the sheer magnitude of death and destruction, luring them in like a moth to an ever so enticing flame. Some were worried that the demons of Khorne would seek to reopen the dormant Red Angel's gate, to summon forth Angron, allowing the Primarch to complete the bloodbath he started all those years ago. Soon, Tzeentchian hosts descended too, glittering nightmares shaped of writhing energy, their ambitions paradoxical and unknowable. But as their warp storms erupted across the planet, the demons fell into each other in an immaterial battle for dominance, transforming entire regions into inhospitable hellscapes as they sought to create their own domains within this mortal realm. And speaking of mortals, naturally, some fled, but the vast majority stood fast, seeing this shift as being yet another part in what they had already come to know as one of the most violent of wars to ever curse the galaxy. There were stories, half believed and rarely repeated, of orcs and humans sometimes fighting side by side against the demonic legions, not as some form of permanent alliance, but just as a point of sheer necessity. Neither party would likely admit to fighting shoulder to shoulder with a stinking Humie or with a vile alien. But as we all know, war does seem to make for the strangest of bedfellows. Nevertheless, the Third War still rages. The Imperials dig deeper, the Orcs build higher, the blood keeps flowing, and the green tide keeps coming. There is no end in sight. And so long as the High Lords keep throwing soldiers to their deaths, and so long as the Orcs still find it fun to join in the scrap, then I do not believe that the Third War for Armageddon will ever truly end. When the light of the Astronomicon finally broke through the darkness, it revealed that Armageddon, through its period of warp-induced night, had changed. It was no longer the world it once was. It had twisted, the sky bled deep hues of blood, while demons stalked the lands, savouring in the raw energies of the eternal war which never halted for even a moment. The grizzled survivors, still numbering in the billions on each side, had only grown more fierce, desperately fighting one another, partly for the long-forgotten ambitions of their superiors, but now also to prevent the planet itself from becoming a demon world. Now reconnected to the wider Imperium, every new day saw the piling of new bodies, the rising of new fires, and a growing, inescapable sense of madness. Demons flowed through the cracks, orcs poured in from the stars, and the Imperium, too committed to the endless war, kept sending fresh-faced reinforcements, still hoping to turn the tides, despite knowing that the oceans had long since turned red with blood. The pressures of war and the new intrusions of the warp were beginning to push the world of Armageddon to its very limits. Continents groaned as they pushed into one another, forming new mountain ranges, whilst the seas boiled away as nature itself trembled before the scale of its own apocalypse. Above, a choking halo of wreckage now circles Armageddon, made up of the countless wrecks of ships, orbital stations, and of the burnt-out fleets which once thought they could make a difference. This field forms a near-impenetrable barrier around this world, navigable only by the brave, the mad, or the greedy. Salvagers and pirates will prowl within the scrap, quickly scavenging what valuables are to be found, before fleeing from the hell-torn gravity well, terrified of being pulled in and devoured by the endless war for Armageddon. But with this, my dearest friends, I do believe that we have now come to our end. Thank you all for listening to this sermon in its entirety, and do know that when we receive more details on the newly documented Fourth War, that I will be sure to keep you abreast of any major events. But for now, as I close this chapter once more, I must thank each and every one of you, and I will wish you all with a very warm goodbye.